Okay, it's a daunting task for me because I am with all my seniors here, and we are guided by them. Land Conflict Watch is guided by them. Our work is guided by them. So it's a daunting task to actually just conduct a panel, but I'll try and just do it. In My duty mostly would be to just have the conversation flow and pass on the mic to all of them. So I'll start with the introduction. We have Usha Ramanathan with us. She's an independent legal researcher. She works on the jurisprudence of law, poverty, and rights. Her work draws heavily upon non-governmental experience in its encounters with the state. A 6-year stint with the Law Journal Supreme Court cases as reporter from the Supreme Court and engaging with matters of public policy. She has been a regular speaker at various universities, and she is often called upon by the National Judicial Academy in Bhopal and the Delhi Judicial Academy to address judges on various issues of law and poverty and on technology and the law. Welcome, Usha ji. We have Sony Pellissery with us. He's Director, Center for the Study of Social Exclusion and Inclusion Policy at NLSIU Bangalore. Professor Pellissery has been, he has researched on public policy. He is a specialist with special interest in distributive justice. After his doctoral studies from Oxford University, he served as associate professor at the Institute of Rural Management, Anand, Gujarat. His work has been published in Economic and Political Weekly, Journal of Social Policy, Gender and Development, Socius, International Journal of Social Welfare, Journal of Human Rights, Human Development, and many more prestigious journals in India and outside. Welcome, Professor Pellissery. We have Professor Navdeep Mathur. He's Associate Professor at Public Systems Group at IIM Ahmedabad. His research is on the political foundations of urban planning and governance, citizenship and state making, and the politics of infrastructure-related conflicts. He is one of the founding editors of Critical Policy Studies and teaches courses on interpretive methods, participatory theater, and the political and social impact of large corporations on democratic policy processes, human rights, and ecology. Welcome, Professor Mathur. So I'll just start with some leading thoughts that we want our panelists to reflect upon. One, there is clear findings from our report as Mrinali presented, and then later from the case studies that Jeff and Prithvi also presented, that the black and white picture of that's a very presumptive narrative that has been projected often, that environmental concerns or people talking about environmental concerns or their land rights are hurdle or obstacles to project or development, is really not so black and white on the ground. People, it's most often the agency and the rights over land that people want to exercise, and it plays in different ways. We've also seen that there are different kind of equations. Trust level among people for these transactions is very low, as Jeff was presenting. So I would probably, if I could throw one couple of broad questions to each one of you. One, generally, you've seen that in these land transactions, which is one side is seen as an economic resource as an asset for development and growth, and on the other side, for people, it's multifaceted value. Land has, it has cultural value, it has social value, it has livelihood, economic, of course. So there would be contested demands between them. So how do you think these processes play up? What is the role of actors, and what is the equations between these actors that is leading to the situation that we are in terms of land conflicts? So if each of you could probably reflect on that aspect of land conflicts, and one from the findings of the report, you've gone through the report, what are the things that, or any specific things that stand out for you, and how you would like to talk about that? So maybe 10 to 15 minutes each, if you could talk about that, and then we can move on to other questions. Can I begin with Usha ji, you?
I'm not used to giving direct answers, so you'll have to forgive me if I kind of get to the answer at the end of what I say. Although I'll start quite directly, which is that this observation that Mrinali also made, and you made now, and I think your two other presenters also made, which is that it's not like people are saying no to development. It's not like they're saying we will not give up land. They're asking for other things around it. They're asking for fairness. They're asking that what is their due should be given to them. So there are places where people don't want to give up the land. There are places where people are not saying we're not giving it up, we just want a fair deal. I would actually ask for that to be modulated a little bit. I'm not sure it's that simple. I think there is a history to how people respond to projects that are brought to them. There is a sense of helplessness that has developed over the years, where even today we have people saying, okay, we know that this is not a good project for us. We know that this should not be in our midst. And we resist and we protest and we have cases filed against us and we have a whole host of problems that arise. We don't mind facing all of them if what we say has value at the end of it. But if experience shows that at the end of 20 years, 15 years, whatever period of time, anyway it's going to be taken away, then there is a kind of a sense of defeat which steps in at a certain point. So I'm not sure that this is about willingness as much as about what experience has taught people about how far they can go and what they can expect. I don't see that as a good development. I see that prevailing upon people, in a sense, it's like legal bullying, is not the way any country should go. So I think we do need to modulate that. It's not cause and effect. It's history, it's experience, it's expectation, it's a sense of seeing other communities having experienced defeat. It's also saying, it's a constant thing that if you go along with the project, you might get something from it. If you don't go along with it, then others will get it and you won't. So there are various kinds of things that happen within a project. So that's one thing that I would say. I mean, there are places, for instance, in Noida, it is true that many of them were saying we are happy to give up the land for the project, but we need to, we want our lives to improve as a result of that. We are not giving it up so that you can have the project. We are no longer a rural area. We can't do the kind of things that we do are not as relevant in this space as it used to be, say, 30 or 40 years earlier. So, we are happy to give it up, but then our lives must be much better. So if you say you're going to set up factories in this area and we'll become factory workers, that's a very different thing from creating residential housing. You convert that into residential housing and say, now you be watchmen and domestic workers. They're saying that's not the kind of change that we are ready for. So I think what is very good about the Land Conflict Watch reports is that they tell us in a partly statistical and briefly descriptive way, what is happening, and that there is conflict. See, so much of the time we are in denial that there is conflict or that there can be legitimacy to that conflict. I think the report does it, a year after year. What you've been doing is quite remarkable in telling us that, all is not well necessarily with the world, and those for whom it is not well, their perspective too needs to be reflected. And that's the great part of this. But I think a lot, maybe around these reports, there could be smaller workshops where, like you did today with, looking at at experiences from the ground, to nuance what these findings mean. So that's one thing. I also came with a certain agenda in my head. So if I can, use that agenda. See, I do law. We study jurisprudence, and most of the time jurisprudence is something that, teachers teach you in college, and then you understand or you don't, and then you forget about it. But actually, over the past few years, we've learned that jurisprudence is fascinating and all of us need to know at least a little bit of it. So I'm just going to tell you in brief a story of how, what this jurisprudence story is. So the idea of law, positive law, legislated law, is something that the British brought to us. So, this being innocent about the meaning of law is not something any of us can afford. As a country, too, we can't afford it. If you're going to throw away colonialism, then whatever can perpetuate colonialism also has to be either thrown out or it's got to be recast in some other way. So if we look at what happened, it's from the 1850s and 60s, basically, that you find many legislations being brought in. And it's fascinating that the British legislation always talked about how they were passing law because it was expedient. to pass law. So expediency was the reason that they passed the law. And then I'll leave the colonial period with that and say that then we come to the Constitution. And we have two provisions in the Constitution which are directly linked with what positive law is. And so they say in Article 13 that any law that is violative of fundamental rights is ab initio void. There is no validity to once the Constitution comes into being, any law that is violative of fundamental rights is void. Then you have an Article 372 which says that all laws in existence at the time that the Constitution comes into being will continue till it is either amended or repealed or replaced by something else. So these two have often made us think of law in their continuity, and we haven't recognized the disruption that the Constitution brought. A rupture, it is not disruption. There's a rupture that came in with the Constitution. So the purpose of law when the colonizers were here was on controlling people and controlling resources. So when we look at the Indian Forest Act, we look at the Land Acquisition Act, we've continued with those. I mean, our Land Acquisition Act has gone as recently as 2013. And Indian Forest Act continues even after the Forest Rights Act has come in. So the patterns of thinking about law and of thinking about state control are reflected very strongly in the law that we have. And so that the Land Acquisition Act had to be replaced by another law and never got struck down as being unconstitutional is a very important part of how we need to understand land and the resources that go with it. The first person actually to question this idea of law, we keep looking for theorists who've given us an understanding of how to challenge the law. The first person actually, and he's the first important critique of this kind of lawmaking and of using the law and, of what this tool of the law was, what that instrument was. The first person actually was Gandhi. So when Gandhiji was in South Africa, there's a fascinating book. It's a book written by Charles de Salvo, and I've taken to talking about it in many places because I really think we need to understand how we have got here. And we won't understand it unless we do a little bit of homework on that. And the book is called The Making of the Mahatma. This De Salvo has gone to South Africa, looked at all the archives of the cases. A lot of the history of Gandhi is written without looking deeply at the cases that he argued when he was in South Africa. And his politics around law developed in South Africa through the cases. He was a man who studied, who got his degree in England, came back believing in the law, wanting to be a lawyer. And then he goes to South Africa and then he tries to use the law in the courts. And then he finds that this is actually something that the state controls, that you can't, every law seems to give the state more and more power over people. And like one of the students said it in one class where we were discussing this, he said by 1913, Gandhiji left the law behind in South Africa. So if you think about what he did when he came back, his encounters with the law were to reject the law. So whether it is a sedition trial or it is Dandi March, they were a rejection of what could be done by a state through the law. So even if we were to continue with the structure of how law gets made, law can't mean the same thing after the Constitution. So I think it's a lesson that people have taught the state, but neither people nor state has learned it. I mean, people haven't acknowledged fully what they've done, I often feel. And the state, doesn't acknowledge it at all. It doesn't see it that way at all. So if we look at PESA, or we look at FRA, or we look at the new land acquisition and rehabilitation law, we find that there is a huge shift that happens where it is not about power of the state, but it is about people and their lives. It's not just about rights of the people. It's much more than what we recognize as rights of the people. So I think my request is that we learn to read law differently and to speak about the law differently so that becomes common coinage in how we think about the law and not just continue colonial practices. Courts do that because courts are, they have to follow precedent. So if you look at Land Acquisition Act, they followed the precedent from colonial times through the Constitution, and they've continued with that. And now we know that the judgment on, the article section 24, it did the same thing. It didn't recognize that there had been a rupture and that this law represented the rupture. But I also feel that we didn't articulate it well enough and that we didn't recognize it clearly enough. So my request is that, when we look at conflict, I'm also talking about it because a lot of the time you're saying that people are protesting procedural violations. Actually, one of the basic things in law is that it is procedure, which is 9 points of the law. The only way people can challenge the state is that you're not doing what you should be doing in the way in which you do it. So procedural violations are actually substantive wrongs that are being done by the state. So we need to unpack each of these as we are beginning to engage with them. The other thing is this context of induced vulnerability. I think we saw a good bit of that in this, where when even under the FRA, when people are told that you can have individual rights, but I'm not going to recognize community forest rights. And Sambhav, you had asked if this was a procedural problem or an implementation issue. It's actually a conceptual issue. We are comfortable, the state is comfortable with recognizing individual rights because anything that can be recognized in a person can be taken away. Inchoate rights are always a problem with the law, and that's why it's very important for people to keep creating more and more inchoate rights. The commons are a classic thing of how these rights are inchoate. So I think what you've done in the report is a very good basis for us to start understanding in a certain deeper, more layered way, what this idea of law is, what this idea of the commons is, what is this relationship between people and land, what is the relationship between people and state, what is the relationship between people and lawmaking, between colonial laws and current laws. So there's a whole lot in your report which I would be quite happy to engage with you on over time.
Thank you, Usha ji. If I could now bring in Professor Sony and just flash out the question, and the question that in fact Usha ji have just raised, that so we do see in our database that in many cases, like Usha ji mentioned, there are instances where people just do not want to give up land. They just do not want to give away, no matter what they are doing. So, but we also seeing that in many cases, so that trust level, that whether the processes will be followed, whether they will be better off after, say, what the compensation is being offered, etc. And this is more common in cases where forest land or tribal rights are involved, so indigenous tribal communities are involved, or where people have been traditionally been sort of at a receiving end of the development debate or state, so in areas where they don't see any hope that okay, any better thing would come to them. So that's there in case. But also there has been an argument from the other side, say people who think that okay, we can actually bring both the things together. We can bring what they call sustainable development. That if you take care of all the processes, procedures, and you take care of the proper compensation, you take care of even compensation where people do not have formal rights, so you formalize the rights, and then if you need to take over that land, you pay them enough, you pay them for the loss of livelihood, then things can happen. So do you think that there is a way to look at can the equations when land transaction or resource transactions happen, and how the power equations in these between these actors play, is there a possibility of having equitable or more fair transactions across the board, or there would be always differences of approach, or it may work or may not work?
Thank you, Kumar. Straight away, my response will be a bit of a pessimistic on that. But let me come to it why this pessimism exists. That requires a bit of a broad picture, long story there before we come to these particularities. Also, your earlier question, that is, on the one side, you are seeking resources, and on the other side, we are seeing multiple faceted values of the people on the land. Both these questions go together on this. First of all, of course, congratulations for this very useful report that you have produced, and very nice intervention that your colleagues have made in terms of case stories here. The the value of this report for advancing the democracy in this country is from the mere fact that we all know that NCRB data tells most of the crimes are based on land conflicts, and you are giving a concrete evidence through a set of case studies and documented 600 plus micro events, and therefore it is conflict. When we all think what is conflict, it has got a very dynamic role in advanced democracy. That's the exercise that you are doing and informing us. It is from there that I am taking forward this broad picture. So the broad picture that I want to talk has got three phases. Let me go through those three phases quickly, and then I'll come to this micro answer which Kumar is asking, whether there are feasibilities to take over land with community dialogue. That is the question that he's asking. Is it possible, or is it just not possible? So the first phase within this whole debate is that took place, which many of us know the story of what does property entail? What do we mean by property? And this goes back at least 200, 300 years ago. The famous dictum by the French anarchist Proudhon, who defined property as property is theft. All property is just theft. And this kind of a thinking that took place 200, 300 years ago is also going along with the big debate economist Adam Smith, who talks about wherever there are rich people staying, you will see also poor people. In other words, inequality becomes part of this kind of a economic transaction. So Adam Smith will talk about if you see one rich man, you can see 500 poor people around him. And this one single rich man can sleep one single night peacefully only with the protection of a magistrate. That is, only through the protection of law the rich person can survive. Otherwise, he will be taken over. So that's inequality becomes part of the property game, the property transaction. So that's the first phase of the story. This phase of the story is not a challenge for democracy, because you have state magistrates who protects the rich people, and you have some kind of a peaceful stay between this conflict that operates. As long as this story remains there, we don't begin with the second phase. Second phase begins very interestingly when this changes from a competition of small property holders among them to a new arrangement. That is, working class is beginning to see the possibility of using democracy to challenge the privileges of property. Okay, until then, magistrate protected your privileges through law. And now working class is coming and saying, we are a democratic country, we need privileges, you cannot have these privileges of the property. Democracy is working very actively in the second phase. There is a heightened tension between the mobilization of the working class and the privileges of the property holders. That is the second phase that happens. Third phase is what we are going through. And this third phase is coming because we have a new kind of a thief in the town. Okay, it is not the old kind of a thief which Proudhon talked about, all property is theft. The new kind of a thief comes with what we can name as state-backed capital or state-owned projects. So all this in this very interesting study, all of them are this kind of new kind of a thief, what they're doing. And here is a big issue of state-backed capital working against the democracy itself. That's why looking at the conflicts and what is conflict doing to democracy becomes very important in this stage as to where is democracy going. That is towards which I will connect back to whatever Usha ji said earlier in her intervention. But before getting to that, let me come to this second, to the after the third phase, let me come to the micro details of what this study is about. So what is this new animal or the new state-backed capital doing that creates a new kind of a conflict? This is what is now being studied across the world. It is not just India-specific story. That is, what are mega projects doing? And this has been very beautifully studied in several countries by the Said Business School professor Ben Flyverge. And he classifies mega projects as any projects which is about 1 billion US dollar. And all this, what is reported here, are all this kind. To give an instance of why this is not an Indian story, China built that many kilometers of fast speed train lines between 2005 and 2008 that Europe built over 2 decades. So that is the extent in which fast-paced mega projects are spreading across the globe. And these big fast-paced mega projects are multi-year projects, huge projects. It doesn't happen over 6 months or 1 year. They are transformative. It transforms the locality, district, cities in a huge way. You don't recognize the locality as you would have seen before the project began. Similarly, there are multi-state or different kind of stakeholders who are all involved there. Studying this kind of a mega projects across the world, what Ben Flyverge talks about is there is a peculiar thing about selection of these projects. That is, he points out something called inverted Darwinism. What he says is, in selection of these projects, survival of the unfittest take place. That is, poorest project, not the best project is selected, poorest project is selected. So when competition of the projects are taken place, you have to show this is the most cost effective project that you are selecting. And that is typically done by showing the cost on the land to be very low. And that's where your valuation game comes in. How do you value the land? So the question on multiple values that people find, you really underplay it. You give a monetary valuation there, and then you acquire the land. Now, to directly coming to Kumar's question, to respond to this, why my pessimism is primarily from 2 issues which is involved here in the selection of these big projects. First one, since these are big mega projects, the kind of design and technology that is projected here or that is marketed here is what is called as unique projects. These are unique projects which is not there anywhere else, and therefore there is always the question of non-standard practices coming in. So when court is placed with how do you deal with it, always there will be a unique project that is put up here. So the uniqueness bias is a very difficult thing because you don't have a similar standard thing against which you can judge these projects. So that is the biggest problem that we face here. Second big problem for this big mega projects is what we call as idea lock-in. That is, since they are transformational, since this come with a new idea which we want to put in, some of the cases which Jeff explained, Prithvi explained, in terms of a new industry comes in, you have possibilities of employment coming in, local development coming in. These are all new ideas being thrown up. Once new idea lock-in takes place, there is very limited analysis possible about what is the alternative to it. People are arguing for a particular kind of a new idea. There is a battling. This is where the difficulty of the coherence between 2 arguments comes in. On the one side, you have the argument of you have to defend this idea, which is transformative for this locality. And on the other side, you see a bunch of disparate people who are defending their own livelihood. They are not defending an idea. They are defending their own livelihood. For example, Jeff's stories of Muniamma cannot dig a well, she's denied permission, or Mr. Joe's Telekatl cannot marry. They all look like little battles. I can't sell my land. I can't have an agriculture. They are all little battle against a larger idea, an idea which is being propounded by a big mega project. So the battle between defending an idea is better or defending a livelihood better. All of us say that yes, defending an idea is better, but it becomes a battle between defending an idea and defending a livelihood. Particularly in the report, what is striking is, I think, one of the biggest stake here, the use of the land. It is agricultural land. 44% of the case, it is agricultural land. That is what the report is pointing out. And in India, we have almost 45 to 46% of labor coming from agricultural land, which is second highest in the world. I think after Africa, India has the second highest labor. So we are not merely talking about locked in investment affecting only the land. We are also talking about loss of labor. About 44% of people may be directly or indirectly affected. So that takes me to the question again, back to a bit of a radical issue, which Ushaji pointed out. How do we relook the law differently? I think you are giving my pessimism comes from what you also report here, because you are saying there are 162 cases which are disposed in these 600 plus locations where land conflict has been reported, and after court has decided in 162 places, 135 places conflict has not ended. Conflict is still continuing. So that brings a big question. What is law doing? What is law doing to resolve this dilemma that we are facing, which is almost 83 places where decisions have come from the court, conflict is continuing. That's a big challenge, and that's where I am thinking. When we think about, if we don't think about the law in a different way than the law is given to us, Ushaji was trying to push in that direction, to think about law differently. If we don't think in that way, we are in a big problem. We may be all sitting peacefully here in this country, democracy will be protected because we don't see any coup or we don't see any revolution happening outside, but the democracy will be taken away by law and lawyers.
Thank you, Professor Sony. I think that was quite phenomenal, the conclusion that you make. And in fact, he pointed out rightly that there are several findings about how the legal aspects of land have actually played out in courts. And in fact, not just that many conflicts that have been resolved in the court, they are not resolved on the ground. There have been very interesting findings that Mukta will be presenting in the next session, where there is also clear indication of why certain conflicts go to court, certain do not go to court. So there is also, we need to understand why people are often maybe not keen or are apprehensive of even reaching court for resolution of these conflicts. So something that thoughts that we have to chew upon in later in the day. I'll move on to Professor Navdeep now, and if you want to reflect on some of the points that Ushaji have made or Professor Soni have made about the broader context of why we are in this situation right now about land conflict, but also specifically, I would like you to address, which Ushaji touched upon briefly, about these procedural violations or the demand or contention against procedural violation as came out in most of the conflicts. So Ushaji did mention that this is actually where most of the violations lie, and people are they also articulate their concerns in procedural violations often, because that's how law is also framed. But what does it tell about the other actors, Professor Navdeep? What does it tell about the industry? What does it tell about the state, whose role is as an adjudicator in these conflicts? So what does it tell about their accountability, transparency, when the procedures set out by them itself are not sort of respected or followed, and often bypassed? So that's something that we would like to hear your views upon, and anything that about the report or broader perspective on land conflict that you would like to talk about.
Right. Thank you for the opportunity. I'm just going to first structure this in a way that I can share some comments on the report first. I've shared some of these with Sambhav and Manali before, but I'd just like to share them with the group here. I think that the report is actually a really exceptional effort. The sheer scale and depth of work, thousands of hours of thoughtful observations, perusal of material sources, fieldwork, attention, and engagement comes very clearly in the report with this with the idea of the report. The methodological substance in both quantitative terms, thinking through all the categories and subcategories and the more than 60 variables that you've listed, through which the analysis is done, related to these land conflicts, as well as different constituents of land conflicts. Um, Extremely rich and very rigorous. I mean, it's really highly commendable to have such a systematically led presentation of data and its meanings and contexts, much of which also started coming to light when Prithviraj and Jeff were, adding to your presentation. Um, there are many findings that should be absolutely shocking and a wake up call to the principal actors that have power and resources in those situations, certainly more than the communities that disproportionately bear the brunt. For example, if around half of the documented conflicts are more than a decade old, many more than 2 decades old, and some 3 decades old, with the oldest being more than 100 years old. The implications are that institutions of governance are inflexible to the effects of such long drawn conflicts, not just to the human costs, of course, but also to the sheer wastage of resources as well, and massive wasted investment opportunities for more inclusive development. This inflexibility carries over in so many different ways through different mechanisms and instruments, with all the changes that otherwise may take place in the letters of the law and policy. And this comes out quite clearly from looking at the different chapters in the report and the data, where the law seems to be present here through violations. Basically, that's what it sort of comes out in this report. A very significant takeaway for me from this report is that it's not cynical. There's a section devoted to resolution, and a high number of disputes were considered resolved through either judicial processes, though some still continue as conflicts. Lots do continue as conflicts, and it could have led one to make the judgment that judicial processes or statutory protections are sort of irrelevant, but not completely, right? The presence of many resolved disputes through state institutions um, connote the positive possibility of reducing conflicts through the transformative capacities of state institutions. Having said that about the report, I just wanted to, I think some of the questions that it raises and some of the points that I've sort of been asked to reflect on. I come from a management or a business school, and I guess part of my role is also to reflect on what these big actors, businesses are doing. In the business school context, there is a very strong sympathetic or empathetic perspective to business as a stakeholder in society. Whenever any conversation about industrialization, pollution, all of these things are talked about in the business school context, in that context, there's a starting out, there's that perspective of empathy towards businesses and companies about how much the value they add, and all of that sort of stuff. That empathy has not rubbed off on me at all. I'm kind of really stubborn, 15 years, and none of that has rubbed off on me. Uh, you know, in normal places outside business schools, you would see these actors as criminals, right? Not just businesses and corporations, but also this other large actor that enables businesses and corporations, that is government, right? So which has a mechanism, an institutionalized mechanism of lawmaking and everything. And as you know, the violations, the judicial processes, the way they go. Two is, by definition, the kinds of laws that are created are for protections of actors such as this. When organized theft is okay, but everything else is dealt with by through sheer violence, basically, one way or the other, to the most marginalized. And another part of Delhi just now, there is a group called Safe in India Foundation, and they're releasing a report called Crushed. They have been working with workers who lose their hands and legs while they're working in automotive factories in Gurgaon, Manesar, right? They have half of those people, and they've been documenting this for the last 6-7 years. Half of those folks have been having these accidents in quotes, because of machines that have these sensors that malfunction. right? So they have these sensors, and they're supposed to prevent this machine from falling in a way that hurts the workers, and it doesn't really do that. And there are many reasons for this. And I think that businesses are the same thing. They're dehumanized machines. These sensors, which we have legal protections for common resources, or they have there's the human cost of doing things, social responsibility, all these things. These sensors aren't actually intended to work in a way that prevents the consequences of what has been talked about in this report, right? People are going to get crushed because that's the nature of that work, that is the kind of industrialization process that we have, the way in which businesses are privileged by government, and which is supposed to be the custodian of public values, etc. And that's, partly is the academic curriculums followed in business schools and schools of economics that are inherently dehumanizing. You're not going to have a tool or an instrument that will fix the system from within that curriculum. That curriculum is essentially dehumanizing, right? The kind of economics applied to business, neoclassical economics, is entirely, basically says all these things, externalities. You can calculate a cost of human loss, but just look at what we are talking about. We are talking about the loss of people. We're talking about the loss of animals, insects, plants, vast amounts of species, right, that are irreplaceable. Right? So even if somebody says, oh, let's look at the value of the ecosystem, and people do that, and there's nothing wrong with it. I think it's worth doing. But that value intrinsically, unless it contributes to something that has of economic value, will amount in this calculus to nothing. And the point is, no, it actually amounts to something far larger than all of this stuff put together. The loss of language and the loss of peoples also connotes the loss of ways of world making, ways of thinking, ways of imagining different worlds that are gentler to the environment, to nature, to the way in which people live together. Those are irreplaceable imaginations, and these conflicts, the ones that are being documented, actually behind that is something immeasurable. I mean, investment values are kind of just the tip of what we are talking about. Those values, to be realized, could be far more harmful than what is the flip side of this. Why are businesses, why are these actors lack accountability? Governments don't go what's the word, I'm not good with it, suo moto, to prosecute businesses that violate anything, right? Most businesses, these large transnational corporations, aren't governed by anything beyond moral invocations. They have this I think in the UN level, they have something called some kind of a voluntary compact. It has a name, social compact or some global compact. So they have a bunch of things that they agree that they will do, which will protect minorities, labor rights, environmental concerns. It's voluntary. There's no penalty for lack of compliance. And national laws in the countries where these member states who signed on to them are already whittling down those laws internally, so that these businesses cannot actually be prosecuted, right? So it's voluntary on the one hand. So one wonders that the idea of accountability has been eviscerated right at the foundation of how this relationship has been formed and continues to unfold. Then I think that it's asking for accountability, after the gun has been kind of shot, and there's nothing that one can sort of do much about it. In the I guess, just to add on to the procedural violations are also part of the story, in which there is a kind of an overlooking of the way in which businesses operate on the ground. I think a lot of people may be familiar with what Vedanta was doing in Niyamgiri, and where they had started mining in Lanjigarh already prior to the approvals given. So rather than seeing it as a procedural violation or an issue that could be fixed with the procedural violation, would be that the interests and agendas of the state, which are of industrialization in a certain way, are being enacted by these corporations. So then procedural violations don't seem to have as much validity or relevance as sort of just enacting it's seen as public purpose. What corporations are doing is seen as public purpose. So I think that the words responsibility and accountability aren't applying as much at all to the foundation of the way these organizations are working. And as I said, going back to this business school management context, economics, neoclassical, most of these conversations happen in spaces where those actors are quite dominant. They loom large. So they start out with saying that the problems that we are talking about are kind of marginal. They'll all be evened out. There's nothing more to see here. People are working on it. It'll take time. So they're very dismissive of the implications of what is here in this report. I just like to end. I have sort of no better way to end than a couple of lines from Hannah Lalhan Pui's book. If he's a young writer and scholar from Mizoram, who basically writes in towards the end of her book that I've never thought that people would have to flee from their own homes, because home is supposed to be that place where you run to when you flee from something bad. And I think at several different levels, the way in which this entire implication that this report is coming through is that home of course of people metaphorically, but also of metaphorically where we started as a species, a human race among other species, is absolutely irrevocably broken and lost. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Professor Mathur. I think that was phenomenal. In fact, specifically, I think the businesses as nature of businesses as an entity, because we keep hearing, we have several conversations that, okay, there have been globally a new regime or a new understanding emerging among businesses or finances that you have to invest responsibly, you have to be more transparent, and you have to address these issues on the ground when you're building these projects. But what you're saying is that there is an inherent problem in how the businesses approach things. And just to be very clear, we did engage about this report with the industry actors. We did call them for this dialogue and conversations. They received our report but did not join. We also engaged with the government, and government took us data. They had conversations with us about this, and they agreed to come, but they couldn't join, I think, for whatever reasons. So we did want these conversations to be hear everybody's side as well in this, but unfortunately they didn't join. I'll just do one quick round of questions again, and then I'll open up for audience for the questions. As Navdeep already sort of laid out the nature of business as an entity and what sort of plays out in this. One question both to Professor Sony and Usha ji, again about the nature of the state in this, how that plays, and why things don't change. So more specifically to you, Professor Sony, that we see in the narrative that at least in the policy narrative, that there has been discussions that, okay, investments are getting locked and we have to really move fast. We have to move fast by removing hurdles, etc., etc. But it's the approach that they've seen. We have seen, I think there are a lot of experts on environment here. We have seen that there has been an approach which is, say, diluting the process of safeguards so that the projects move faster, or say even diluting the procedures to take over land. And we have seen that there has been dilution of Land Acquisition Act provisions across states, and there are exemptions given. But that doesn't help on the ground, right? So projects are, in fact, in the past 9 years, we specifically looked at data. The investments, cost overruns, and project this time overrun has only increased because people are very much cognizant about their rights and their agencies on the ground. Why does when it harms their own interest agenda, projects are stuck? Why in policy making this is so difficult to understand? Why it can't be incorporated? What plays out when policies are implemented? Specifically, I would like you to address that. And after that, Usha ji, if you could talk broad sense and like state, like why it would never actually work, as you said, because the state of nature is a certain, I mean, the nature of state is a certain kind.
Yeah, the response is largely because the way projects are selected, the projects are prioritized, the answer cannot be seen only if you look at the project selection. There is the wider aspect of how the design of a particular developmental project comes into a locality, and that is through a process of the competition that takes place in the economic arena. This is where the broader picture of what happens in the project design and political competition for particular type of projects to come to your constituency becomes important. So there is always the other area which says that if this project is not something which your political competitor will look for, there is another person who will grab that project. So in that competition, you always have to show the lower cost for attracting the project to a particular area. So that political economy of how project selection takes place, the precedence over the what is seen as soft concerns of discussions, getting people to agree to the concerns. So you are playing out between what you term as soft concern over your concrete political competition concern. Otherwise, you will be having you will not have anything at all here. So that kind of competition is backed with the business law nexus. That's why I was talking about the possibility of law to thwart our democracy even, because that nexus exists between the business and law. So in that game of political competition, you have a backing of law coming in saying, yes, it is possible you can ignore these little soft parts. In the policy realm, there is no quick solution that can come from above for this. I think reports like this enables civil society players to show it as a broader picture which operates out there, and to see that what we are facing is not merely a simple project instance of one kind, but rather pattern. It's part of a larger pattern, and then this kind of a projects can be taken on ground to educate people to see that we need to put this on the way of resistance. That is the only way to get the policy right. And if we still believe in democracy, that is not a lost game, because always you also have got positive stories where you are seeing, yes, there are occasions when people felt happy that my demand was met, and therefore we should, in the policy realm, we should not see that conflicts have no place. Conflicts have got a very important place to shape the policy. What I am only saying is it won't happen from above. It has to be conflict generated from the bottom, and then informing the policy to reshape the policy that is being thrown to people, as in whichever way you can, as schemes or crumbs or whichever way, but that is being get a better human shape because it has been informed through a conflict. In other words, conflict generation becomes an exercise in creating a better policy, rather than seeing a policy came and therefore I have a bad conflict. Conflict is bad. Not necessarily. In a democracy, you always see conflict have got a positive way of shaping the policy that is given to you.
Thank you, Professor. Usha ji.
On the nature of the state, see, the thing that we start when we learn, the thing that we start with is in saying that it is the state that makes law, and it is the state that controls all forms of violence. That's why something is seen as conflict and something else is not. Like when corporations go and tell the state that, listen, you better get land for me, I can't get it for myself. They too have a problem with the state. When they're asking for ease of doing business, they have a problem with the state. But the engagement is of a different kind. The thing is, one of the things that I think has bothered me in a lot of this is that some of the really good legislations we've got has come because of what has come from the ground, and it's been an inexorable force. So it has to reach that point where it's inexorable. And it has come, one of the things that has helped is in the change of language, which means the change of imagination. And very often we need a change of imagination. Like land acquisition was always called land acquisition till it became mass displacement. So long as it was land acquisition, you could only talk compensation. But when it became mass displacement, it changed the very nature of the thing. So the LARR has acknowledgements that I honestly never thought in my lifetime I'll see in the law. I never thought project affected people will go beyond policy into law. And that happened because there was no way of making a law. There was no way of dislodging what was happening. There was no other way of acknowledging conflict other than recognizing this. For the first time, you have Schedule 5 areas, PESA areas, being openly recognized in the context of the Land Acquisition Act. So the idea of different kinds of relationship with resources has started getting acknowledged. Citizenship is always a huge battle. The one thing that does bother me, however, is that, it's one thing about the state. I mean, the state decides who it's going to be relying on to produce what the state wants. So the state wants GDP, it's not going to rely on people. It's relying on business, and GDP then becomes the most important thing. So we have to change the nature of the game. I mean, all around, if you're going to be talking today, actually we have an opportunity now with climate change, where we are saying GDP can actually be an indication of distress, climate distress. I'm just saying we need to change the nature of that whole discourse. And in that, in the 80s, for instance, we had this thing of impoverishment, and then we had dispensability of people. And this is a very dangerous thing, because in the conflict, what I find very refreshing about your report is that you're not talking about people who are, who are the generators of that conflict. That is not the cause, but the practice of conflict. You're not referring to them as victims. Very often, for the longest time, we thought of people as victims of development. And if there's one thing we've learned, it is that in state policy, state and many others, including the dominant community which is unaffected, they don't have patience with victims. Victims are seen as a burden and a drain on the system. And they are not victims of that. They are actually people who are battling for their rights. There are many people who may not be able to battle and just lose, but they are not just victims. So, the way in which we talk about the state and the way in which we represent the issues that we are confronted with actually dictates the direction in which we go. So, for instance, the state currently, very interestingly, from when I was talking about expediency in colonial laws, now they are talking about legal sanction. To give legal sanction to whatever the state is doing, you can't make law, not in a constitutional framework. So there is a way in which there is an adoption of language even by the state. And the state is constantly in a state of exception because it decides to what to put into the law. And after putting it into the law, it can say, okay, I'll decide who to proceed against and who is the wrongdoer. It's a decision that I will make. These are challenged only by people from the ground. So I actually think that, the people that you've written about in your report are people who are practicing citizenship. And a state has to be, the constant job of citizenship is to bring the state to heal. This is something that we are seeing in the data place too. And the state will not come to heal if it can afford not to. So the training of, when you said lawyers, and I was thinking lawyers have no training in any of this. They are dealing with Schedule 5 cases without ever having been to a scheduled area without ever having met people who live differently. I mean, when we did the tribal committee work, there were many people asking us, so what is there about being a tribal? Everybody wants education, everyone wants a job, everything is the same. That flattening out, which is done by ignorance, how do we then inform it? It needs, one, it needs language. It also needs it needs the commonness of this language in our midst. So much of business language has become part of what we automatically think about. Why aren't we able to generate that language and proliferate it? And without that, that imagination will not change. So it's not just about the state, it's about we are trapped in imaginations too, and we need to work our way out of it.
Thank you so much, Usha ji. I think there is a lot of food for thought for everyone, and I'm sure audience would have a lot of questions, so I won't take much of time. We'll have half an hour for conversations between audience and panelists. So I'll open up now, and if I could also request Mrinali, Mukta, and Anmol to also join, the authors of the reports, in case there are questions about the report itself. We'll just begin with that. So, questions? Please introduce yourself and then please shoot the questions. And so we have just half an hour, so I would request to be brief in your questions. Thank you so much.
Can I start? My name is Sandhya Jain. I just want to know, I think it was Professor Pellissery who made the point. What is the issue about having a municipality in the Schedule 5 areas? If you could explain that.
I think not by me. I think this was something which was personally, yes, I think.
Our colleague Jeff presented that story on municipalities and scheduled areas. As I was also an author, I can elaborate a little bit on this. So the research that we did saw that certain gram panchayats were being upgraded into municipalities in scheduled areas, and because municipalities are explicitly prohibited by the constitution to be established in scheduled areas, you essentially have a local body which is not functioning legally in these areas. And as a result of that, the previous local body, which is the gram panchayat or the gram sabha, whichever one is applicable, it basically ceases to exist. So that was what our research was around, that where you have a local body and you're questioning whether or not they can even operate legally in these areas.
Yeah, that's actually interesting. That's correct. It's also that when in a fifth schedule area, you designate, you take more parts of the panchayat into the municipality, the PESA stops operating there. So it basically means you're de-tribalizing in a sense by putting it into a municipal area. And so you break down, like you were saying, we break down gram sabhas, we break down. So the kind of decision making that's made under PESA, that changes when it comes into the municipality. No, see, for instance, in Rourkela, they want to expand the municipality. Once they expand the municipality, the rules by which they operate will be different. So you don't have to take the permission of, from the Gram Sabha. You don't have to go through that process. It becomes a completely altered process. It's a breaking down of a system that exists.
Yeah. My name is Neil. I'm an advocate and a policy consultant. So I wanted the opinion of the panel on this aspect, right? So one statistic which jumped out for me from your report is that the two states with the largest number of land conflicts is Gujarat and Odisha. Now, at the same time, these states have had successive state governments or governments by the same political party for decades now. So I wanted your view on why, when you have on one side the state government which is responsible for generating these conflicts, right, something as core and as intimate as land, and at the same time you have the electorate electing the same government back to power successively and for successive terms, what could possibly explain this dissonance or this dichotomy where the state on one side is generating conflicts as intimate as land, and at the same time you have the electorates electing the same governments back to power? Or if you can view it from another way, what is the state government doing right or wrong which makes the electorate elect them back to power despite them creating these kind of conflicts?
Mrinali, you want to respond to the distribution state-wise, and then anybody else who wants to add?
Yeah, so I think I also mentioned it when I was showing the heat map. So that was just to show a distribution of our conflicts. So it was not really indicative of, the intensity of which states are more prone to conflict, etc.
So, if I could just add to that, so the distribution of conflicts in a database, it depends on a lot of factors. So, it is basically what number of conflicts have been reported, and not essentially the number of conflicts that are actually taking place. And because I think even after working for 6 years on this work, it's very difficult to say when we have captured the universe of conflicts. So it's not comprehensive, but it is what the data reflects as of now from the reporting. And reporting from different states of these conflicts depend on several factors. It depends on how easily accessible the information in that state may be. For example, we have fewer conflicts in northeast state doesn't mean that those states have less conflicts. It's just that at times it's difficult to get researchers or people to consistently report from those regions, or the accessibility of the information. Having said that, I think there is still would be some reflection of how the policies of development in a particular state would go by, and how aggressive the projects implementation etc is in different states. So which could be one factor, but we do not have data to say establish that correlation relation in terms of state. But if any panelists want to comment on that, yeah, please.
I mean, I don't know if I can answer why doesn't some of this conflict translate into political opposition. One could be that it's much more spread out in terms of voters and constituencies and things. But two is that at least Gujarat, from what I understand, has been it's kind of a carceral state with respect to opposition, like social opposition. There has, I mean, I'm not sure what its current rank is, but there was a point a few years ago where it ranked second in the murder of RTI activists. If you look at this ranking, if you just Google this, you'll find the ranking. I think Maharashtra was one and Gujarat was second. That there may be some changes in the ranking, the number of cases that are documented of people who are in prison who organize protests. If you look at the Statue of Unity protests, if you look at the protests around the bullet train, all of these folks, and earlier Narmada Dam, of course, people know how the state has dealt with quite a lot of violence there. It doesn't translate into, because there's its domination of the media and the way in which it puts these ideas forward are attractive to a whole vast swathe of the electorate, it seems. And that's why, and you know, that may be the reason why it doesn't translate so much.
Mukta, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, so interestingly, we'd actually carried out an analysis last year of 4 states that were going to the poll. So in 2021, Assam, West Bengal, Kerala, and Tamil Nadu had legislative assembly elections. So we analyzed land conflicts in these 4 states to look at trends in land governance and the kind of impact that they've had on elections in the past and poll promises. So what we found was that land conflicts and land governance didn't always feature in poll promises or the platforms of the party on which they were contesting on. But interestingly, in the state of Assam, for example, where we found in our database the most number of conflicts are based on eviction. And this idea of eviction also originates from the idea of the other. So issues like that actually featured in poll promises, and the communities affected in these conflicts are actually very vulnerable communities who don't always form the largest voter base who elect parties to power. So that's something we noticed through our research last year.
Yeah. Any other questions there? Yeah, the back.
Hi, thank you. I'm Ayush Singhvi. I'm an advocate and also an environmentalist. Thank you for initiating.
I think your mic is not working right now. Or just get closer, yeah.
Yeah. It was an interesting jurisprudential discussion in the beginning from the 3 professors. And I feel like it was forward, which was a discussion on how law works, what is lawful. And I would like to ask their views on basically the difference they see between what is lawful and what is just. Because just as Usha ma'am mentioned in the very beginning, there are provisions in our constitution on how laws have to be there. Similarly, there are provisions in our constitution which says that the constitutional courts will do complete justice. When we talk about procedural difficulties, etc., following a proper procedure is an essential aspect of principles of natural justice. So where does this interplay, and where does this interplay between law and justice come in this discussion of discussing conflicts?
Usha, you want to take this?
And before I come, just one more clarification on this. I think Jeff or Prithviraj also mentioned that there was a law on the municipality in scheduled areas which was introduced, which was thought about a long time back in the early years of the first decade of the century. But then that's it, they dropped it. So without a law, so under the constitution, you have to enact a law where only some provisions will be extended. Like you have panchayats extension, provisions of panchayats extension to Scheduled Areas Act. You are supposed to have one like that for municipalities too. So they're trying to dodge it without making a law on municipalities. That's just to complete that thing. But lawful and just, see, this actually is, I think this is what I was saying then, that Gandhiji's whole thing was that, when the law is made by the state to meet the state's purpose, then you can't expect justice from it. And that's why he rejected the law. And he saw it as a tool. Now, for us too, when we are talking about justice, if we actually look, say, at the NREGA, or we look at the NFSA, or we look at how the RTI could be, and how part of it at least it is. If you look at all those legislations where people have demanded and got laws, we find that it is closer to a version of justice if it is respected. The state still has the ability to dodge the law, or to pretend that it's above the law and therefore not. But this is what makes it so important for us to figure out. Like saying, if people have to be asked to move from a place, the very idea of forcible eviction is something that's been rejected around the world. And yet, in the report, we find that there are so many cases of forcible eviction. What does it even mean? It means that, you're basically, people say no and you say tough luck, you don't like it. And, the panchayat, the example that was given in Kerala was classic. Okay, I'll give you a chance to speak to the panchayat. And then the panchayat speaks. And then they say, well, I don't like what you spoke, so I'm going to overrule you. Now, that's no way that we can get justice. So the just law, if we have to convert the nature of law so that law acts for a people, that the law acts in a way where the rights of people are put at the center, then the extent of engagement we have to do with the law is also huge. But it is also that we have to change the nature of that law. It's not just the nature of the state. We are continuing with seeing the law as we are continuing to see that the law is still a tool for the state. And that perception, which is what colonial law was, and now we've returned to it being made for legal sanction for whatever the state wants to do. That is completely, the moment we do that, we're going even beyond colonialism. We are just going to law not even as a tool, but as just a display to say that we also have laws in this democracy. So justness will come, it's very hard work, but we know that it's been achieved before. And then, of course, we have to work at that law being enforced and seeing what we do with that law. But you can see from the report that after the LARR, there is a certain sense that, okay, maybe we can get proper compensation at least, which didn't used to exist before. So it's a complex, it's a simple question with a complex answer. I'm sorry, there is no way that it can be said more simply than this.
And if the permission from the panel, if I could add few findings in that context from our report itself to that. So as Usha ji was mentioning, that in fact, citizens and people who are at the forefront, who are at the front lines of these conflicts, are very much aware of what is the legit rights of them, even if their formally legal rights are not recognized in these conflicts. So, for example, we're fortunate, and after the struggles of communities, we have, say, a right like Forest Right Act, which formally recognizes rights on forest. But on non-forested commons across, there is no there's no formal procedure for recognition of rights, but commons are the ones which form the maximum number of conflicts in our database also, and that's because people know what legitimately and what they are, what they should be given, not given, but what is legitimate for them, what they deserve in a democracy. So that's why these conflicts happen in cases. If they don't have a formal ownership of land, they do deserve that. There's a right to housing is their right, and they do settle on commons. And when evictions happen, their conflicts happen in such cases. But the state always considers such commons, say, property of the government and wasteland, and gives. So there would be a detailed discussions, I think, in the third panel on that. And we have another bunch of findings that Anmol has worked on and Mukta has worked on those. So we'll get to that. But any other questions, please? Yeah, gentleman there and then lady here.
Hi, my name is Vishak. I'm a former media person, currently working as a communication consultant with FES. So my question was that, taking from what Usha ji said in the beginning, right at the beginning, that the report, what the report says and what people feel on the ground, there's a bit of a difference between that there is some sort of a fait accompli that people feel they are facing. If they, so the protest, what does it mean for the civil rights movement going forward? And secondly, is development, there was a lot of conversation about what development means earlier on in the civil rights movement. And I don't see much of a reflection in that today. Development means different things for different people. Development is not just industrialization, to put it succinctly. So this is my question. How does the civil rights movement take this thing forward?
Who wants to take this? Any volunteer? I would also request if you can point out the question to who you're addressing. That would be better. But this one.
Usha ji, perhaps.
See, actually, I see all of this, the existence of conflict as an assertion of civil liberty and of civil rights. So I didn't see the two in a completely disconnected way. It's also important to see the extent to which criminalization happens. I think the Draupadi Murmu, the president's statement on who's in prisons and what they are doing there is actually pretty significant. And I think it's also significant that she deviated from her written speech to say this. We do see that prisons are full of people who are many of them are people who are contesting or who are seen as threats to this or as obstacles to the mode of development that the state wants. And the state's wish has to be fulfilled, and therefore anyone opposing it is, and this is not new. This is something that we've seen. I don't think in the first 20 years when we were still thinking after independence and after the constitution, we saw this kind of thing as some, people who you'll put in prison. But as people began to realize that what the state is doing is producing sacrifices of people who are getting, at that time, in the beginning, we used to call them marginalized. And then you found that the margins kept growing. So it's no longer just marginalization. It's also dispensability because they don't need to be cared for after that. And we've had to deal with that, to demand an acknowledgement of the person as not being dispensable to any, to whatever development processes. So this idea of development part of it has been in, through the environmental movement, and part of it has been through people saying that if we are not relevant to this, then it can't be development. So, but, the interesting thing also is that every time, like when we had the Indian Forest Act, the colonial state was also saying that they wanted it for the process of development. You have the Forest Conservation Act coming in, and it says that we are taking this power to divert forest for a non-forest purpose because of development. Then you have, trees being cut down and therefore saying that all right, replace the tree. Like somebody said, it's not just the tree that gets lost, it's a whole biodiversity that goes. But still saying that, okay, and then saying that project authorities don't seem to be able to deal with, with trees, so let them give us money. And then that money becomes so much. It's such an indication, that Campa fund that exists is such an indication of how much devastation has happened in forest areas and how little ability there is to correct it. So every one of these has produced its own heroes, in a sense. I mean, many of those who are fighting, fighting not just for their rights. In the process of fighting for your own right, you're also fighting for a whole host of other things. It's also challenging the paradigm of development. What we are seeing now, actually, I find deeply disturbing, because in fact, your report says this to me, that because land is so, heavily contested, when people know that when they lose land, they're not going to get anything that will take them through generations like land can. So there is a greater, and it's tangible. You know what you're fighting for. With water. But with data, you don't. And the idea that we are moving into a digital economy is part acknowledgement that, we are not just able to get land whenever we want it. And therefore, we move into data. But it is also making objects out of a whole population. And I think that, for me, the contrast between seeing what happens when it is land, which we know, can see, can experience, and know the loss of, and data, which we know none of these about. And yet, our whole lives are being taken over and converted into something else, and, we just become shrapnel in that, in a sense. That I think is a lot in terms of how we understand civil rights and civil liberties when we talk about land, but we don't when we talk about something that is not yet presented itself in any form, to our minds. So I think there are lessons to be learned. I mean, I really don't think that the development question has kept coming up, and the state has had to use repression to be able to proceed, which means that there is when somebody said, is democracy dead in India? I said, no, so long as people are standing and saying what they think, and, the jails are full of people who are actually speaking up for what they know is right. And these are creations of crime. These crimes are not acts that should be criminalized. They are criminalized because they're criminal because they don't conform to the imagination of the state. That I think it's in that space that civil liberties and civil rights exist.
Thank you, Usha ji.